Well, thank you very much for the warm words of welcome to Dr. Cobb, and for extending the invitation, and to all those who are responsible for this summer seminar on civil rights and civic virtue. It is always important to examine both civil rights and civic virtue, but to bring them together is both important and timely, especially in the times in which we live today. So thank you all, as well to those who are giving up part of their summer to be a part of this dialogue, conversation, and exploration. I'm going to keep my eye on the clock, but I want to dive right in, so we can save a little time, perhaps towards the end, for some questions and discussion as well. I've titled my remarks for today, given the instructions that Dr. Cobb passed on, Fighting for Freedom Rights in Lowndes County, Alabama, 1965 to 1966. I want to back up a little bit first. Of course, for the students and participants in the summer seminar, during the last hour, we had a wonderful engagement, exploration with the Selma Voting Rights Campaign. And I understand that this afternoon, the participants are headed over to Dallas County and to Selma, Alabama. Of course, at the start of 1965 in Selma, Alabama, the campaign around voting rights heats up. Of course, 2 years earlier, Bernard Lafayette and his wife Colia head down there as members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and they're working in the trenches with high school students and local people trying to get organizing around the voting rights, but even before that time, you had Amelia Boynton and others working for several decades with the Dallas County Voters League. So there's always local people on the ground doing something. But in January of 1965, the voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama heats up with SNCC activists, more SNCC activists coming in and partnering with Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As the Selma movement gains steam, as the Selma movement loses a little steam as well, as there's this hostile white resistance to extending the franchise to African Americans, we find that Jimmy Lee Jackson in February of that month in the neighboring county during a night march is murdered. And of course, murdered by state troopers while protecting, literally shielding family members, his mother and his uncle from being assaulted. And once Jimmy Lee Jackson is murdered and loses his life, we see SCLC calling for this march to the state capitol, to originally James Bevel, SCLC activists, angered and infuriated by yet another loss of life of an African-American activist, says that we're going to bring his body, the body of Jimmy Lee Jackson, from where he was murdered and take it to the state capitol. And then this gets sort of boiled down, if you will, as the march from Selma to Montgomery. But there's something going on that's important to recognize and acknowledge in this moment, is that when the call for a march by James Bevel and SCLC is made, SNCC activists are actually opposed to it. So this is before Bloody Sunday, right? There's a meeting that's held. So the original march will occur on March 7th, 1965. That Saturday, that's a Sunday. That Saturday, SNCC activists and SCLC will have a meeting. And SNCC activists say, what's the point of this? Like, one, what's gonna come of it? It's too dangerous. At that point, SNCC activists had moved beyond these sort of large-scale mass mobilizing events that would draw attention, perhaps, but also ran the risk of tragedy. And so SNCC activists as an organization actually officially opposed the march. But they said the chairperson of SNCC at the time was John Lewis. Of course, it's featured right here, and we will know from history is at the head of the march. They said, we can't, as an organization, forbid any individual from participating in a protest, even though we don't think it's a good idea. We'd rather spend our time and energy organizing and building this grassroots leadership than in a demonstration, although we understand its purpose and point. They said, we can't forbid a member of our organization from participating in the march. So John Lewis, John, if you want to go ahead, you can go ahead, but you march as an individual, you don't march as a member of SNCC. Now that's important because what we're actually seeing there is a disagreement on tactics and approach. Now, too often we pretend as though, so there was this sort of harmony, right? Like everybody was just singing freedom songs and everybody got along. Now, to be clear, there was unanimity in what the goal was. That goal was freedom. Now, how we got there was always tactical and strategic differences. And sometimes they were very intense. And this wasn't just connected to this particular moment and this particular event. I mean, this goes back, as far back as the institution of slavery. How are we going to get free? Some people like, we need an all-out rebellion. Others are like, no, that's not going to work. So you've always had these strategic and tactical differences. I point this out because we're moving into this 1965, 1966 period. We're moving into a new phase of what the Black freedom struggle would become. We're moving away from civil rights protests and into the period of Black power politics. And what happens in Selma and Lowndes County is critical to that transition. But we frame Black power as suddenly this radical break. This is where all the conflict suddenly emerges and is really unfortunate. No, there had always been pressure and conflict and tension between organizations and between individuals. That's just another manifestation of it. So I think this moment is important because we have to get away from sort of civil rights good, Black power bad, right? And understand that what is about to come is literally a logical extension of what had come before. And of course, SNCC turned out to be right in that what happened on Bloody Sunday, what happened when that march begins, is what would become Bloody Sunday, sort of violence in the extreme that just so happens to be captured on camera and broadcast to the nation and to the world. SNCC makes a decision at that moment that is in keeping with sort of the decision-making within the movement as a whole. Going back to the Freedom Rides, and I know the participants in the seminar, went down to the Rosa Parks Museum, talked a little bit about the Freedom Rides. If you recall from that moment when the Freedom Riders, the original Freedom Riders head down and are attacked in Anniston, Alabama, and then attacked again, the second bus in Birmingham, Alabama. Those original Freedom Riders at that moment, especially those out of Birmingham, were like, all right, we just gonna fly the rest of the way, right? Like we're done, right? Like, we made our point, this ain't getting any better. We're heading down. Originally the goal was to get down to New Orleans, Louisiana. Like, we just gonna fly the rest of the way. Couldn't find a flight out, but they were like, we're gonna fly the rest of the way. So that was gonna be the end of the Freedom Rides. Until what happens? Until reinforcements come in from Nashville, Tennessee, from members of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right? Even though they knew it was dangerous, those activists coming out of SNCC literally are writing letters home, not just in case they died, but because they knew somebody was likely to die, right? Open upon hearing or send, if I get killed. Why? And Diane Nash, one of the freedom riders, SNCC activists, who was actually organizing in Selma in January of '65 with James Bevel, she said, we never, part of one of the core ideas of the movement is never let violence stop a project. You can never let violence stop a project, because if you let violence stop a project, if you let violence stop a demonstration, you let violence stop a movement, then the opposition will just continue to resort to violence. One of the things that we don't do a good job of in talking about civil rights history is we don't talk about how violent it was. We don't talk about the reality that violence, racial terrorism, white violence, was the default response to Black activism. It always was. This wasn't something that just comes about during the 60s, 50s, and 60s, right? I mean, the default response to any attempt for Black freedom had always been violence. Violence was the cornerstone of slavery. Violence was the cornerstone of freedom. And so we see this default response being what happens on Bloody Sunday. Well, the default response for activists to racial terrorism and racial violence was to keep going, was to send in reinforcements. And so SNCC activists, although they had opposed that original march, although they would be doubly upset with Dr. King when he has to sort of turn around 2 days later or so and doesn't push forward, they say, if the people are going to march, then we're going to support them. We're going to put in our full resources to help them in this particular journey. And so we see that SNCC activists will be a part of the Selma to Montgomery march. But because they had already decided that they need to be doing more in terms of organizing people on the ground, organizing local communities, that was SNCC's sort of thrust, guiding principle. We're going to build local leadership. We're going to help organize local people. And because they had already moved beyond large mass mobilizing events as being really critical to moving the movement forward, they say that we're going to support the march. We're going to participate in this 5-day march. But what we're going to do is we're going to organize in the wake of the march. We're going to organize in the wake of the march. And this is a map of the march route from Selma to Montgomery. And it starts in Selma, goes about 7 or 8 miles. And then the bulk of the march is through Lowndes County, Alabama, rural Lowndes County, Alabama. And then the tail end of the march, so 3 days or so are spent in Lowndes County, Alabama. And then the tail end of the march is, of course, in Montgomery, Alabama. When SNCC activists say that we're going to organize in the wake of the march, we're going to participate in this march, what they were saying is, as this march moves through this place called Lowndes County, Alabama, we're going to reach out to the people who come out. We're going to talk to the people who come out to see the march, to see the marchers. And we're going to see if we cannot begin an organizing project in this place called Lowndes County, Alabama. Now, why Lowndes? Conveniently, of course, it's along Highway 80, and you have the march is proceeding through Lowndes County, Alabama. But at the start of 1965, in this place called Lowndes County, Alabama, there were 0 registered Black voters. 80% African-American, 5,122 African-Americans of voter registration age, and not a single one was registered to vote. In other words, political exclusion in Lowndes County, Alabama was absolute. It was absolute. Not a handful, not a couple, not some because they have some connections to white people. No Black people, 0, were allowed to participate in electoral politics in Lowndes County, Alabama. And it was no secret why. Because Lowndes County had a reputation of extreme racial terrorism. The nickname for Lowndes County, this is what I named my book, was called Bloody Lowndes. And this wasn't a name that SNCC activists gave to the county. This is what people in the region called Lowndes County because of the long history of racial violence and racial terrorism there. Bloody Lowndes. And so SNCC activists, after, and just a small number of them, sometimes we think about sort of civil rights activists and we think there's scores and hundreds and sometimes thousands, right? A team of hundreds descending on Lowndes County, Alabama. It was 4 people. It was 4 people, all under the age of 25. Right? Stokely Carmichael, Kwame being one of them, who had no place to stay, who at the end of the march circled back with a handful of names and numbers in their pocket. That's it. Like this team, this army is 4 people. 4. But they're on a mission. They're on a mission to connect with the local people of this county. And what they find when they circle back is that the folk in Lowndes County, Alabama, a small handful, only a couple dozen, had already started to move. So this is one of the things that's critically important to keep in mind when we're thinking about the civil rights movement. Nobody in the movement, no local folk, wherever they are sitting around waiting for some movement messiah to descend from on high and arrive and lead them to freedom. Right? They're not waiting for anybody to come in and tell them that there's a problem. Like they understand that there's a problem. They've been living with this problem. They've been living with these challenges and living with these difficulties. Now, what they can use is some help. What they can use is some expertise. What they can use are some resources. But they're also smart. They also are making assessments of whoever comes in, who are you, what are you bringing to the table? And in a place like Lowndes County, what are you willing to fight against? Are you willing to stick this thing out? Because anything that I do is going to put my life on the line. And you have to be willing and ready to put your life on the line as well. When SNCC activists head back into Lowndes County, and this is 2 images of Stokely Carmichael that I use in the book, but that I think are particularly powerful, and they're not usually the images that we see of the civil rights movement, certainly not of Stokely Carmichael. This is one of Stokely Carmichael, who later, I'm using his name, Stokely Carmichael, he changes his name 68 to Kwame, but in this moment, he's Stokely Carmichael, and I think that's important. So that's why I'm using his name, his original birth name, until he changed it, because this is what he was organizing under at the time. Like this is the side of the civil rights movement of the Black freedom struggle that we don't often see. Right? Stokely Carmichael wearing overalls in a field with a Black farmer, talking about what it is that they're trying to do. Because what they're doing, so this isn't a march. There's no other TV cameras around. There's no microphone, right? This is early morning, late afternoon, day after day after day. In March and April, May, June, through the summer of '65, Stokely Carmichael and that small team talking to local folk about what it is they're trying to do and talking to local people about what it is that they want. That's critically important, right? And trying to get them, usually the first thing was you knock on the door, and it's that canvassing, the slow, hard work of organizing. And you're not trying to get people down to the courthouse to register to vote. There wasn't nobody getting registered at the time. Hopefully you could get them there in a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. But the first thing you want to do is get them to answer the door. The second thing that you want to do is see if you could get them to come to a mass meeting. And so we see SNCC activists holding these mass meetings with local folk, talking about what it is that they were trying to build. But back to this idea of movement messiah, Stokely Carmichael wasn't a movement messiah. When he gets in there, what does he find? He finds people who had already been coming together in a small group, right? Just 2 dozen, right? But this is part of those names. So when they're organizing and talking to people, when the Selma to Montgomery march is cutting through Lowndes County, like people are saying, like, look, you need to talk to John Hewlett. You need to talk to Lillian McGill. I hear they're meeting and talking about. So they're like, okay, they take those numbers and they connect with these folks. Local people already on the ground who are trying to figure out what to do. I had a chance to interview, and we'll talk a little bit more about people like John Hewlett in a second, who becomes one of the critical leaders of this local movement. And I had a chance to interview him before he passed away. And I said, well, why did you all choose to partner with SNCC? Because that's a decision that is made. Actually, Dr. King and SCLC, when things began to slow down in Selma, Alabama, in February of 1965, before the Selma to Montgomery march, before Bloody Sunday, King sends out Andrew Young and a small group of sort of emissaries into Lowndes County, Alabama, and says, see if we can't get things started there. And they meet with some local folk who were thinking about trying to register to vote or going down to the county courthouse, and they report back and they say, yeah, it's too dangerous, right? King makes one visit to the day of a voter registration attempt and never sets foot in Lowndes County again. He says it's unorganizable. It's too dangerous. Too many people will be killed, and people do die in Lowndes County. But in asking Hewlett, what was the decision? How did that happen? He said, no, SCLC didn't sort of abandon us. He said, we chose not to partner with SCLC. He said, we chose to partner with SNCC. Well, why was that? He said, SNCC wasn't talking all that nonviolent stuff. He said, well, what does that mean? He said, nonviolence in Lowndes County, Alabama was going to get us killed. So we had to let white people know that we were willing to fight back and we were willing to shoot back. And SCLC and SNCC activists were like, y'all do what you need to do. So he said, we purposely and intentionally chose an organization that would allow us to defend ourselves on our own terms. So when SNCC activists come in, they begin to partner with these local folk who are already starting to move, but don't have that movement organizing expertise. Not in the same way that somebody like Stokely Carmichael, who had been organizing, although he's just 24 years old when he moves into Lowndes County, he had been spending the last 4 years organizing in places like Cambridge, Maryland, and in the Mississippi Delta. Even though he's just 24 years old, just graduated from Howard University, he's already an experienced and veteran organizer. And so they're bringing that with them as they partner with SNCC activists. They're also not coming in. SNCC activists, Stokely Carmichael and others, are also not coming in without ideas of their own, right? So when Carmichael comes into Lowndes County, Alabama, he already has in the back of his mind this idea that he wants to create an independent political party. Carmichael's about politics and power. There's within the movement, certainly within SNCC, but in the movement as a whole, it will really, especially in the Southern movement, there's sort of two groups of people, if you will. Broadly, we can classify two sort of classifications of people. It's like those folk who saw the principal problem that Black people were facing as being moral. This is Dr. King. This is SCLC, John Lewis, Diane Nash, James Lawson, who's really the prophet of nonviolence, Teachers King, Bayard Rustin. They saw the problem of the movement, the problem that Black people were facing, the problem of white supremacy, for example, as principally being a moral problem. This might be worth discussing when we get to civic virtue, right? They're like, this is a moral problem. And if it's a moral problem, then it needs a moral solution. And that's what nonviolence is. Nonviolence isn't just a tactic. It's a way of engaging the oppressor, right? James Lawson talks wonderfully about this, right? He's like, listen, if we respond with violence, then not only do we become like the oppressor, we lose the opportunity to teach the oppressor. But the idea of nonviolence and putting your life on the line, becoming that sacrifice, is to touch the moral conscience of the person who is doing the violence, of the person who is doing the harm, which hopefully will get them to move and change, move off of that position and change their behavior. So these were appeals to morality. These were appeals to moral consciousness, even if it was putting your life on the line in a physical way. If it's a moral problem, then it requires a moral solution. But that's a small segment of the movement activist population. That's the segment that gets a lot of attention because that makes white people feel good. But the vast majority of African Americans did not see, activists and others did not see the problems that they were facing as being fundamentally moral. They saw the problems that they were facing being fundamentally about power. They saw it as a political problem. Disenfranchisement, losing the right to vote was a political problem, not only land and economic problem. Carmichael would say, he was like, I wasn't interested in changing, quote, I wasn't interested in changing the moral consciousness of some racist thug. I wanted to change their behavior. So they saw this as power. This is a power problem, a power deficit. And so if the problem is political and a lack of power, then the solution would be gaining power. And so after having spent time in Mississippi and helping to create the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which gets turned away in Atlantic City in 1964, SNCC activists move into Alabama, first principally thinking about Selma, but also move into Lowndes County because they're like, listen, we need to see how we can create a model for organizing Black folk to gain power. And so Carmichael moves in and SNCC activists move into Lowndes County with this idea in their mind about how can we help local people gain power? How can we take over the county courthouse? We don't know how we're going to do it, but that's our goal. That's my goal. That's what I want us to do. That's what we need to be thinking about. But you can't walk into rural Lowndes County, Alabama that has 0 registered voters, and you don't know any of these folks, a place called Bloody Lowndes, and say, hey, we're going to form an independent political party. That shit ain't going to work. Right? The folk on the ground be like, man, what are you talking about? That doesn't even make any sense. Right? So organizing lesson 101 is you don't go into a county, you don't go into a place, you don't go into a community telling them what you want to do. You go into a community asking them what they need you to do. And when they asked what they wanted, how can we help you? To be sure, people were talking about, listen, voter registration, is something that we're interested in. But then when they listened, suddenly there was a whole slew of goals. Did I just turn that off? I think I did. Oh, wait. I think I'm good. There we go. There we go. There we go. There was a whole slew of sort of goals that folk had in mind, right? And so one of the first things that happens, setting aside that you have in March '65 that these Black folk had already started to register, attempting to register to vote, right around the time as the the Selma to Montgomery March takes place. But one of the first things that they say to SNCC activists is, can you help us with this boycott of the Negro training school, of the segregated Black school? Can you help us with a boycott of the county's segregated Black school? This is 10 years after the Brown decision. There is no desegregation happening. It's not even, 10 years later, they're not even thinking about it's even possible. They're like, we are dissatisfied with the quality education that our children are getting at the Negro training school. Can you help us with this boycott that we are organizing to improve the resources, get rid of the principal, get some athletics, get some lab stuff? This is what we want. They didn't say anything about desegregating white schools. They didn't say anything about integration. Can you help us improve our Black schools? This is important because this speaks to what we often don't associate with the civil rights movement. Like, to back up for a second, first thing is we shouldn't be calling it a civil rights movement. Like that's a terrible misnomer. And in fact, it wasn't what people on the ground historically called it. Like, we literally can pinpoint exactly when this thing called the struggle for Black freedom becomes a civil rights movement. And it's in the late 1950s, as a result of the Cold War, when activists sort of on the moderate political spectrum with the NAACP and others who are lobbying Congress, who are lobbying elected officials outside the South to support desegregation, to support ending Jim Crow, they begin to frame what they're doing as pursuing civil rights. Because conversations before that, they're talking about freedom. But in the context of the Cold War, if you're talking about freedom, then that could be associated and was used by the opposition, those segregationists who were trying to maintain sort of a white supremacist way of life in the South. They would use your calls for freedom to undermine what you were doing by saying that, oh, this is freedom, this is communism. Right? This is what's happening in these efforts to decolonize countries in Africa and Latin America, right? And so if you change the language and stop talking about freedom and start talking about civil rights, how can you oppose civil rights? Civil rights are simply those rights that government guarantees that all citizens in the US are entitled to. So we're just asking for those government guarantees, which makes sense strategically if you're lobbying for state officials. But what's lost in the switch to that terminology is the broader set of goals and objectives that Black folk had always been fighting for. What's lost are the human rights goals and objectives, which are so critically important as well. Constitution doesn't say anything about education, but this is one of the first things that Black folk are fighting for. And they're not just fighting for it in the 1960s. This is the other thing that's critically important. Not only do we get the terminology wrong by focusing solely on civil rights and we lose that human rights component, is that we don't start at the right time. We should be talking about the Black freedom struggle and what African Americans are fighting for during the era of slavery forward. Right now, you have all this conversation and discussion about what's happening in Florida with Florida state standards. I've seen Alabama state standards. Y'all shouldn't applaud too much. But in Florida, and we see in the conversations that one of the things that we don't do, and we haven't done, it's not just Florida, I mean, we haven't done this as educators, we haven't done this as historians, is we don't take Black people, and certainly enslaved Black people, seriously as political thinkers. We don't take Black people, we certainly don't take enslaved folks seriously as political thinkers. We don't. There is nobody who had a better understanding of what it meant to be free than a person who was enslaved and yet living in the presence of people who enjoyed their freedom and were denying them theirs. We like to talk about James Madison, the father of the Constitution, the father of the Bill of Rights, architect of the Constitution, father of the Bill of Rights. Just sitting up in his library, in his plantation home, right, locked away with some 3,000 volumes, reading the Greek philosophers and the English philosophers and all these other folks, coming up with sort of what would be the Bill of Rights, those fundamental freedoms that no government should take away. He's like, yeah, he was reading that, but he was also just looking out his damn window at the 100 enslaved people that he was denying these basic rights from as a third-generation enslaver. Right? He's drawing on his experiences. And guess who fundamentally understood the value of that Bill of Rights? Those 100 folk who were being denied freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of mobility, freedom of speech, freedom of petition. Like enslaved folk understood this. They didn't need some white abolitionist to come down and tell them, look, we think the slavery thing ain't working out for y'all. That's us buying into these myths, because that's what enslavers, that's what white Southerners told themselves so that they could sleep at night. They had to tell themselves, right, that our enslaved folk are content. Because to think otherwise, how are you gonna sleep at night if you think every Black person here wants to kill you, wants to see you dead? The only way, if you were enslaved to Jefferson, Madison, or George Washington, the only way you got free is if you were sold, you died, or they died. So to sleep at night, white folk come up with this myth, white enslavers come up with this myth, right? That, oh, it's these outside agitators. It's always somebody else who's gonna come down and ruin our Negroes, spoil our harmonious racial relations. We saw that in the White Citizens Council advertising. Well, harmonious, that's white people telling them, feeding themselves a lie. Because Black folk understood what the stakes were. But Black people weren't suicidal. This is the other thing. Black people are not suicidal. This is why you don't see more enslaved rebellions. Because enslaved rebellion in the US context was suicide. Because you outnumbered. You could take out a plantation owner. You might be able to take out a couple. But soon you're going to have to deal with the county militia, then you're going to deal with state militia, then you're going to deal with the federal government. And you're not winning that battle. So you find other ways to resist. But they understood. And so while they are enslaved, African Americans are formulating in their minds what it means to be free. And how do we know? It's like putting it on paper. Well, some of them are. Those who wind up securing their freedom. Like you read Frederick Douglass's narrative. I mean, he tells you exactly what Black people want. But then people are like, wow, that's just Frederick Douglass, right? He's an exceptional Black person, exceptional Negro. What about, certainly these average, Black folk who were born into slavery and don't know freedom. Like we actually have to go back in the moment that we're talking in the moment now because of all this silliness. Like we got to go back to like anti-lost cause 101 lessons. Because this is actually what we're getting. And it informs how we understand the struggle for freedom afterward. Right? So people talking about this is the slavery benefits Black people. I was going to say something that's not nonviolent, but we're just going to leave it for a different conversation because this is about civic virtue. The moment of emancipation tells us everything that we need to know about slavery and what Black people were thinking. It's critical that we talk about slavery. It's also critical we talk about that moment of emancipation. Not because it helps us understand what happens afterward, but because it helps us understand what came before. You see, at the moment of emancipation, African Americans, enslaved African Americans, 4 million, do everything that they wanted to do before, but couldn't, because this is the opportunity. And what do we see? We see them organizing immediately for a broad spectrum of civil rights and human rights. Everything at that moment of emancipation. Heading down, like literally within weeks of gaining their freedom, we see African Americans doing what? This idea of cultural and social integrity. It doesn't say anything in the Constitution about that. Going down to the county courthouse to get their marriages recorded in legal documents. Marriages recorded in county courthouses so families could not be separated and labor couldn't be stolen. You didn't need a union officer to tell them to do that. They're going down because they had to live with family separation and loss of labor for generations. First thing they do. That's a human rights issue. The integrity of my family. One of the other things that they do, one of the other first things that they do is they move out of white churches. Now, sometimes, Alabama's a good Christian state, right? So a lot of white Christians get a little upset at this, can't figure this out. And it's funny, I enjoy reading plantation records. People are like, man, that's kind of like, no, white people say everything. right? And you look at some of these old church records, right, from the moment of emancipation, right? And you read them and they're like, we don't understand why all the Negroes are leaving, right? So the Black folk are like, one, you made us come, and two, the God that you're worshiping isn't the God that we're worshiping, right? Like, so we're out. Cultural autonomy. Black folk forming their own churches. And one of the first things they do, like immediately forming their own churches, that's that cultural autonomy. Now, they do take one white member with them, Jesus. But that's a different lecture. But other than that, everybody else is Black. Cultural autonomy. That's not that's not a civil rights issue, that's a human rights issue. Education, moment of emancipation. See all of these petitions to the Freedmen's Bureau, to the federal government, send resources to missionary societies, send resources, please send teachers. When African Americans begin to join or be a part of state legislatures, what the first thing they do? Creating a public education system, valuing education, making a sacrifice, not pushing, not saying, like, look, even here in the state of Alabama, first public schools coming out of Reconstruction, led by Black legislators. But they're also conceding, like, you know, fine, you want to have it segregated, that's cool. We don't really want our kids with you anyway. One of the other things that we see very early on is nobody's talking about integration. They're talking about non-discrimination in public accommodations. They're not talking about integration. And here again, white folks, we get obsessed. Sometimes, you know, we let our, you know, the general sensibility, white sensitivity inform our understanding of Black action and activity, right? And this is our obsession with understanding or trying to make sense of what Black folk are fighting for and how they're fighting. But we think Black people are fighting for, or the struggle is about proximity to whiteness. That Black people are trying to get close to whiteness, trying to move into white neighborhoods, trying to move into Black schools. White schools, proximity to whiteness. The Black people understood that the most dangerous place for a Black person to be was in a majority white space. The absolute most dangerous place for a Black person to be. During slavery, during Reconstruction, during the period of disenfranchisement and Jim Crow, the absolute most dangerous place for a Black person to be was to be in a majority white space. So they're building up and trying to strengthen Black spaces. It's only, we're looking back and saying, oh, well, you know, Black people wanted integration, right? You know, you have a handful of Black folk who make a conscious decision, who realize and understand, particularly around education, and this connects to the Brown decision, that there is something. Look, I teach at the Ohio State University, because that's what it says on the check. So as long as it says that, it's the Ohio. But I'm a graduate of a Black college, right? Historical Black college, Morehouse College. And my wife is a graduate of a Black college, Stokely College. So I come home and, you know, the last 20 years teaching at Ohio State, and I tell these stories about, you know, all the students at this, students at that. And then I look in her eye and she's looking sort of like puzzled. And I'm like, oh, see, you think I'm talking about Black students, right? Like, no, I'm talking about white students, right? Because Ohio State is very, very, very white, and it's getting whiter, and it's only going to get whiter as we move in this anti-affirmative action, the end of the era of affirmative action now, right? And so I teach a lot of white students, and I know something about white students, and I'll let you know this right now. Ain't nothing magical about white students. Ain't nothing magical about white students. They're just as smart and just as dumb as everybody else. But they do have the power to attract public resources and take them wherever they go. And so there's a strategic calculation about integration. And that is, after 100 years post-emancipation, the resources that Black people need to gain and have that quality education will never come as long as Black folk are in isolation, as long as segregation is the law of the South. And so integration is necessary to gain access to resources. That's a strategic decision. It has nothing to do with proximity and we just want to be close to whiteness, right? Even when we see that first generation of students who move into Black schools, we're talking about a handful. I mean, these are soldiers, if you will, whose parents are putting them on the front line. The vast majority of Black folk are like, no. And it's only when we begin to see desegregation further underfunding Black schools that we see a greater push to move into predominantly white schools. I mean, desegregation does not proceed on an equal footing. But Black people are like, look, if you just give us the resources that we need for our schools, we'll be fine. Because the goal wasn't integration. The goal was quality education. And that goes back to that moment of emancipation and proceeds through the generations forward. So what we see at the moment of emancipation then, this is what I mean by freedom right. We see African-Americans, formerly enslaved African-Americans, reflecting on their experiences in bondage, taking Black people seriously as political thinkers. African-Americans, formerly enslaved, reflecting on their experiences in bondage and identifying those basic civil rights and human rights that they have been denied as enslaved people. And saying that these rights are the crux of freedom. And this is what we're going to be fighting for. They set the agenda that Black people will be fighting for the next 150 years. Sometimes it looks a little bit different, right? Whether it's schools in 1890, and this is you think teacher-student ratios are crazy now, right? I mean, this is a one-teacher school in Lowndes County, Alabama. But it speaks not just to the terrible teacher-student ratio, but it speaks to the desire of people to gain some modicum of education. They would take whatever they could get. And 100 years, 150 years later, 140, 30 years, wherever we are from this moment right now, we got the nerve to talk about Black people are uninterested in education. There's never been a moment where we haven't been fighting for gaining access to education. That's part of what it means to be Black. That's in the soul of the people. Housing also becomes another one of these things that Black people are fighting for, right? One of the first things that happens in Lowndes County, Alabama, when SNCC activists go in, Black people are like, look, we want to improve our Black schools, we want some voter registration, CPK on the books, but we also need some better housing. And so they develop a self-help housing program, drawing on some government grants that SNCC activists are able to apply for, bringing in that organizing expertise, which is so critically important. So this idea of, what are Black people fighting for? Their goals and objectives, they are civil rights to be sure, those rights that government guarantees. But we also have to look at the human rights objectives. Constitution doesn't say anything about housing. Nothing. And yet this is something that Black people are consistently fighting for. From that moment of emancipation on, we're not living in slave cabins, we're not living in slave quarters. We want to improve these sharecropper shacks, get some glass windows, right? We can't gain access in the 1920s, 1930s to decent, modern, private housing. So petitioning the federal government to develop public housing, that's where public housing comes from. The push of African Americans, they were frozen out of the private housing market. And then even today, when we're talking about affordable housing, it has evolved, but housing becomes one of these critical issues that African Americans are fighting for. And it's a human right. My daughter, I'm a girl dad, full-on girl dad. And my youngest daughter who's 8 now, when she was 6, she's always asking questions, asked too many damn questions. But she said, we were in the city and she's, She saw some folk who were unhoused, right? And she was like, why? This is a question. She said, why don't people have homes when there are so many houses? Why don't people have homes when there are so many houses? And the answer to that is because we're okay with not everybody having a home. We allow it to happen. But this is what Black people are fighting for. This critical question of how that's a human rights issue. And so in order to understand what it is that, understanding goals and objectives is critically important for understanding the movement as a whole. Because if you understand goals and objectives, you understand what it is that, what it is not only what people are fighting for, but you'll understand how they are fighting. Because that's impacting what it is they're choosing to do, who they're choosing to partner with. Because not at all times can you organize around the same, with equal energy around the same issues. So African Americans there's never a time where African Americans are uninterested in participating in electoral politics. But in Alabama, you have the 1901 Constitution. So once the 1901 Constitution goes into effect, that just completely wipes African Americans off of the voter rolls. And it's not that Black people are like, oh, that's unfortunate. They understood that they show up at the county courthouse in 1902 in Hayneville, Alabama, in Lowndes County, and attempt to register the vote, that they're gonna get killed. That's the racial violence, racial terrorism. It's not just what you put on the books, it's what you reinforce what's on the books with. That racial violence, racial terror. But doesn't mean, so you got, in most places in Alabama, especially in the Black Belt, you don't have African Americans organizing around voter registration for half a century. For half a century. Not because they're disinterested, but because they realize it's futile. Why am I going to give up a valuable life for a valueless vote? Because even if I can register to vote, who the hell am I going to vote for? In the all-white Democratic South. And this is why when SNCC activists come in, they do what? They say, listen, we're going to help you around this education thing. Right? We're going to help you around this self-help housing, but we're still thinking about power. And what does power mean? And how can we obtain power? And we understand, too, the context in which you are organizing. And that is this extreme racial terrorism. This is a photograph of Elmore Bowling, the business person in Lowndes County, Alabama, who was murdered, who was lynched in cold blood in 1947. This is the context that Black people are organizing around, or organizing in. And we can never forget that, because that informs and shapes everything that you're willing to do. Because most Black people, whether in Lowndes County or elsewhere, are like, look, we're not getting involved in this way. And we look back at the movement, we think of everybody. Sometimes I ask my students, like, well, how many people were at the march? Like, how many people were at the March on Washington? Like, who was at the March on Washington? The largest civil rights demonstration of the era. My students are like, everybody. I'm like, everybody? They're like, everybody. Everybody wasn't at the march. What are you talking about, right? Like, in a local movement, if you got 10% of a community to participate openly and actively, that was considered a huge success. 10%. So these were small numbers. Why? Because people are not suicidal. People are trying to stay alive. And they're making these strategic calculations because they know this history and the history of racial violence and racial terrorism, the sacrifices that people would have to make going forward and what they would be asked for. And if you didn't lose your life, you could very well lose your livelihood. Okay. So African Americans who were, one of the things that happens in Lowndes County is after African Americans attempt to register to vote, start showing up in large numbers, then they begin to get evicted. Right? And now I'm talking about, you can't evict a landowner, right? So you have these small pockets of Black landowning communities, which are critically important. But the people who get evicted are those folk who have been living and working as tenant farmers and laborers on white folks' land for decades, if not for generations, 20, 30, 40 years. And as soon as their name shows up on an attempt to vote, register to vote, then they're thrown off the land. Sometimes we say, you know, about those who have less means, who the poor folk, right? It's like, oh, they should participate in the movement. They don't have anything to lose. Those who have the least have the most to lose because they can lose it all. And so those tenant farmers who get thrown off the land after living on, in their entire lives. In order to keep them in the community, SNCC organizers form these tent cities. Because these are the people who are willing to sacrifice and have already sacrificed everything. And when those tent cities go up, they immediately become a shooting gallery. When you drive down to Selma along Highway 80, you'll pass you'll pass some markers that mark tent city. As soon as those tents go up, SNCC activists help put them up. They become a shooting gallery. But guess what? Black folks shoot back. Is that armed self-defense? We can talk about nonviolence. That's cool. But in America, as long as you got the Second Amendment, you can make an argument that self-defense is a civic virtue. I'll leave that to y'all to discuss. But Black folk are fighting back. And this is actually the image that we should keep in mind when we're thinking about self-defense, right? It's not a Black radical with a beret and afro and all that stuff. It was these ordinary folk who were in their community. Like, I don't have to tell y'all in Alabama, you understand Alabama's a gun culture. And that's on both sides of the color line. It ain't just white folk. There's Black folk too. Now, Black folk couldn't display their guns in the back of trucks, right? But they had them, all of them, and they were willing to use them when it became time. I know my time is almost up, but I came a long way, so we're just gonna keep going. Is that okay? In August of 1965, we have Lyndon Johnson and others signing the Voting Rights Act. Now, usually we think about this moment. Too often we think about this moment as the end of the movement, right? Now, sometimes we might jump ahead. We'll get to 65, signing the Voting Rights Act, and even at the time, you had white folk outside the South, good white folk, right, who were part of this, who were like, look, y'all got the 64 Voting Rights Act, y'all got the 1965 or the 64 Civil Rights Act, you got the 1965 Voting Rights Act. What else you Negroes want, right? Like this should be good, right? We're all good now, right? Like, no, what happens with 65 when you get the Voting Rights Act is it begins a new phase of the struggle, right? This is why, the quest, see, before 1865, African Americans were fighting for a literal freedom. And they're talking about it in those terms. Because if you were enslaved, you wanted your freedom, right? You wanted the end of the institution of slavery. But if you were free, you understood that you could never enjoy your basic civil rights and human rights in America as long as the institution of slavery existed somewhere. So freedom was what Black people were fighting for from the very beginning. Freedom. But after 1865, African Americans are fighting for this combination of civil rights and human rights. They're fighting for a different kind of freedom. I call these freedom rights, but they're fighting for these. And they're using that language all the way through the civil rights movement, all the way through this thing we call the civil rights era. This is why you have freedom organizations, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. This is why you have freedom parties, you have freedom co-ops, you have freedom songs, you have freedom schools. The language of the people is freedom, because that connects both those civil rights and human rights objectives that Black people are fighting for. Well, after 1965, August 65, and you get the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the question then becomes, and a SNCC activist, Cortland Cox, framed it like this for people in Lowndes County. Now that you have the vote, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with it? Now that you have that, it's still dangerous to register, but now that you have it, what are you going to do with it? Circle back to Stokely Carmichael. Had been organizing in the county for 5 or 6 months, had gotten webbed in, had demonstrated his commitment and seriousness to helping folk in Lowndes County. Once they finally have access to registering to vote, that's when he poses the idea, shares the idea, you know what? Y'all should form your own party. Chart your own course. A local member of the community, Frank Miles Jr., he said when this was posed to them, he said, we thought about it. He said it didn't make sense to join the Democratic Party. This was the party of Lyndon Johnson that had just turned away Fannie Lou Hamer in Atlantic City the year before. So it didn't make sense to join the state Democratic Party of Alabama, which was the party of George Wallace, whose slogan at the time, not Wallace, but the state party of Alabama, was white supremacy for the right. Like white supremacy was the party slogan for the state of Alabama. I said, why are we going to go into that? It doesn't make any sense. And then the local Democratic Party said, these are the people who had done the killing in the county and beat our heads. and Republicans were non-existent. So he said it made sense that if we were going to pursue power, that we need to pursue it on our own terms. And so that leads them to create the Lowndes County Freedom Organization and choose as their ballot symbol a snarling Black Panther. This is the birth of the original Black Panther Party. The symbol of the Democratic Party was a white rooster. And these are rural folk, of course. And they said they understood the relationship between cats and roosters. They said cats chase roosters, and when you catch a rooster, you eat that rooster. That's what we're gonna do. All right, we're gonna catch that rooster, and we're gonna devour that rooster. We're taking over Lowndes County, Alabama. But what we see here that's so phenomenal is that what happens in Lowndes County, the formation of this political party, isn't just simply politics as usual. And this is one of the things that we can learn from looking at the movement, right? Is that, what they do in Lowndes County, Alabama is they say wealth, whiteness, and previous political experience, educational attainment are not prerequisites for holding office. Then we're done. We're about creating an agenda that is empowering people. Alice Moore, who's 42 years old, would serve as the run for tax assessor in Lowndes County, Alabama in 1966. When it's dangerous to do so, you could be killed. Threats on her life, home being shot into. You know what her slogan is? This is a platform. They would have these mass meetings, and they would call up the candidates, the 7 candidates, the sheriff and tax assessor, tax collector. They would call up Alice Moore, and Alice Moore would come to the front of the church, right? And they say, everybody's giving these speeches and talking about what they're going to do. And Alice Moore said, my platform is tax the rich to feed the poor. And then she sit down. That's it. What else needed to be said? So not only are we talking about sort of freedom rights, a combination of civil rights and human rights, but we're talking about a different kind of democratic practice that SNCC interjects, drawing on the lessons of Ella Baker, this small d democratic organizer, right? Applying her organizing philosophy to electoral politics. And we see that manifesting itself in Lowndes County, Alabama in 1965 through the formation of the Freedom Party. And one of the things that they do, because of the high rate of adult illiteracy, they create these political education freedom primers, right? These cartoon storybooks. And one of the things that we've gotten very good at in American politics is voter registration. And one of the things that we don't do very good with is voter education. Not just how to cast a ballot, but why are you casting this ballot for this person? We would be in a whole different place right now if we took seriously the idea of voter education. But reaching out to all those through these freedom primers is one of the things that was so critical for it. Stokely Carmichael is an image from when they had their primary and selecting their candidates. I love this image because this is the image that we usually think of Black radicals. This is somebody who's webbed into the community, embraced by the community, right? The joy of what it means to have that small victory of being able to get candidates on the ballot, whether or not they win or lose. And this also becomes this point of transition because it is in this moment that Stokely Carmichael will replace John Lewis as chairperson of SNCC, and he will introduce just 1 month later the nation to the slogan Black Power. And what he says when asked, well, what does Black Power mean? You know what he says time and time again? Black Power means what we're doing in Lowndes County, Alabama. This is not just the birthplace of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, it's the birthplace of Black Power. Creating independent parties to take over to take over control of government in those places where Black people are majority. And moving into coalitions in those places where Black people are numerical minority. That's what Black Power was, a logical extension of both the successes and the shortcoming of the civil rights movement and the civil rights era. That November, African Americans will run 7 candidates for office: tax assessor, tax collector, coroner. I couldn't figure out, when I remember doing the research, this is like coroner. Like, how is the coroner like radical, right? Like what, like I'm talking revolution, you talking about a coroner, right? But that was my own naivety in not understanding local politics, because it was the coroner who determined whether or not a murder is a murder. And all of those lynchings, all of those murders that go uninvestigated were because of the coroner in collusion with white supremacists. Right? So it's absolutely radical to gain control of these local elected offices. Well, in the summer of 66, in the fall of 66, none of those candidates are successful. They're all defeated. And when we think about the movement, just as we have to rethink our sort of movement goals and objectives, we also have to rethink what it means for a movement to be either successful or failure. And a lot of times people will look back at this and say, SNCC will lead the people after this election, it'll lead the county, and nobody won, so that movement was a failure. No, it wasn't. One, SNCC would wind up leaving because that's what good organizers do. Right? You don't organize to create a permanent job for yourself. You organize, if you're successful, to organize yourself out of a job. And so once the folk have the resources and expertise that they need that you brought in, you move on to the next place. But more importantly, we shouldn't measure movement success simply by numbers, by number of votes cast or number of people registered. The fact that Black folk were engaged in this way meant that that local movement was a success, because there will be a ripple effect going on and there's no turning back. In the fall of 1970, African-Americans elect their first Black sheriff, John Huey, who was the first chairperson of the Lowndes County Christian Movement, the movement organization, and then of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization.
What year was that?
It was 1970. So 1970, right? And this was monumental, because guess what happens in 1970? Once you have a Black sheriff, all that racial terrorism and racial violence stops. Fundamentally changed the lived experience of Black people. But what it didn't change was the economics of the county. So African Americans over the course of 10 years would gain control over the county courthouse, as we see in many of these Black belt counties, not just in Alabama, but throughout the South. But gaining political power, gaining political control did not change the mechanisms of economic wealth distribution. So Lowndes County remains one of the poorest counties in Alabama, because there was no job creation. When Black people gained control of the county government, then the local bank, local white-owned bank, suddenly decided that they weren't going to make any more loans to the county government. Coming into power in the 1980s is also the moment of sort of Reagan coming to power and Reaganomics and decreasing in federal funding and the like to local communities. And we see this play out over and over and over again. So there was a question, I'll leave you with this. There's recently was a part of a documentary on the movement in Lowndes County, Alabama. And at the very end, it's on streaming, NBC and Peacock. You can find this, Lowndes County and the Road to Black Power. And at the end, one of the activists who was there, Ruby Sales, she said, this is how they closed the documentary. She said, for all the work that we did, we failed to ask a fundamental question. And she said that fundamental question was, what did it mean to integrate into a burning house? What did it mean to integrate into a burning house? And in reflecting on that and trying to think about that and think about, so, this is a success, having African-American move into the position of sheriff in a place like Lowndes County, Alabama. We just saw, if you remember from earlier this year, the brutal beating of an African-American by half a dozen Black police officers in Memphis, Tennessee. And people say, how could that happen? It's the Black person, these are Black officers, college educated, right? How could they do this to another Black person? They integrated into a burning house. If you do not change the culture of the structure, if you do not change the way things are working, the input doesn't matter, the output will be the same. So King asked that question of where do we go from here? Where do we go from there as well? So chaos or community. Like, we can change the input, but what are we doing to change the output? Is the critical question I think we have to think about as we move forward. So with that, I've left you about 15 seconds for any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeffries. I want to leave space for people to ask a few questions. So who would like to be the first to ask a question? Thanks so much for your presentation, Dr. Jeffries. I've been thinking about integration a lot, and at least at the school level, it was only a small part of your presentation, but I'm wondering, how much weight do you give to the possibility that integration, especially for young children in schools, how the potential that that can reduce anti-Black prejudice? How much weight do you give to that?
Well, I think the importance of schools for socializing our children cannot be overstated, because schools are the most likely place where children across of different racial and ethnic backgrounds will meet at a place of equality, right? Now, two things. To answer that question, two things. One, because of the way we feed our schools, because our schools reflect our patterns of housing segregation, which are very purposeful, K through 12 schools are now more segregated today than they were during the height of desegregation, which is in the mid-1970s, right? Alabama is moving in the complete opposite direction, which means that the most likely place for actual interracial interaction is no longer K through 12, it's actually college. Not everybody makes it to college, and college is going to become much more racially segregated and class segregated, but it's actually college. After that, forget about it, right? Because we move back into our neighborhoods and we're working completely different jobs, right? So school as a whole is really important. So if we can have children interacting within the school space, that's great. But it also has to be, it also has to be done in a way that isn't just, hey, y'all interact on the playground or in the lunchroom, but what's happening with the curriculum in the classroom, right? And how are we talking about these subjects, not just in social studies, but also in ELA, also in our sciences, also in our other courses as well. And so we have to take, any space. I'm an advocate of public education, and that means it should be for the public and for the public good. So I think a lot can be done in that K-12 space, especially with the youngest learners, which has me terrified when we're talking about, oh, we're not going to talk about this with the kids. With the youngest kids, we're going to wait to talk about these issues later on. What are you talking about? Right? Like, stop getting in the way of children, right? Let kids learn age-appropriate ways, but they can learn from the very beginning, right? So starting early, starting often, not just with the social interaction, which is great, because this is going to be a long time, if ever, before we actually get to reasonable racial and ethnic integration because of our housing patterns and how we choose to live. But that doesn't matter. If you have a handful, if you have a lot, you can still do a lot in the classroom to educate, so that children begin to move away from harboring these racial biases, because we all have them. That's the other thing, real quick. I mean, that's the other thing, right? And people say, well, you don't talk about race. When you talk about race, you're therefore creating racism. Like, that's stupid. Like, what are you talking about, right? It's like nobody's. One day I'm just gonna like share like all my racist emails that I get, right? Because I keep them. So I like to keep the good ones. Somebody told me you can't just keep all the hate. I'm like, what the hate is so good? Like, you got to keep the nice ones. Like, so I started keeping the really supportive, and it does change the energy, right? But one of the the constant things is, like, if you talk about racism, then you're going to create racists, right? And it's like, no, stop. Right? Like, nobody, or like, are you saying that all white people are racist? Like, stop it, right? Nobody is born racist, right? Nobody's born with prejudice. But if you are born into a prejudiced society, then you will internalize that prejudice. And don't pretend as though this isn't a prejudiced society. Child psychologists will tell us children, infants, babies, 4, 5, 6 months old are already able to distinguish people by their racial identity because the cues and clues they're picking up from their caregivers. Like, we do that to them. And so we had to do the work of getting rid of that bias very early on. And we can only do that if we talk about this stuff openly and honestly, early on, age-appropriate ways going forward. So the schools can be critical, but only if we do the work right within the schools.
Dr. Jeffries, thanks for coming down. We follow you on the social media, formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah.
We appreciate being here today. We talk about SNCC and Al Baker, and then you talked about Bernard Lafayette. So, one question I have for you was, how were they supported? How did they support themselves when they came in?
Yeah, so how did they support themselves really is important, right? Because there's sort of the community support that wraps their arms around them. And it's not all members of the community, right? I mean, we got to give credit to where the credit is due. You have some faculty members at Alabama State University, right, who connect with SNCC activists, say, hey, when you go into this county, you need to connect with this person. So individuals, right, in different places, different communities. SNCC activists could not have done with what they did without members of the community wrapping their arms around them, providing them food, providing them shelter, providing them protection, providing them advice, providing them weapons, right? They could not have done it without that. SNCC activists will also say, and I've had the honor of my life has been able to sort of not only interview SNCC activists, but to continue to sort of engage with them. And they're still working, right? Like if you were a SNCC activist, that means you were 20 years old, like they're in their 80s now, right? And they've never stopped. Like I get students at Ohio State, and they're like, yo, Dr. Jeffries, we're having a march. I'm like, all right, cool. And then like 2 weeks later, they're like, I'm like, we're having a march, we had it. Like, what are you doing now? We're taking a break, we're tired. I'm like, it's 2 weeks, right? Like they've been going for 60 years and still going strong and have never stopped. And I asked them, right, but if you ever hang around like SNCC activists, like people you revere, right? Like, man, these are warriors, right? Man, they're silly as hell, right? I mean, they're cracking jokes, they're telling stories, they're telling lies. Why? Because humor, love, laughter, right, was so important to their own survival, right? And they'll talk about it like, oh, this person, like Stokely, we think about Stokely Carmichael as his firebrand. They're like Stokely Carmichael, Kwame was a comedian. Like he was hilarious. He'd always have us in stitches, right? Julian Bond the same way. And you're like, wow, like what is that? Because that's the humanity. So on that, so they couldn't have done it without community, but they couldn't have survived without being able to tap into and to this measure of self-care that they found in love and laughter and joy, right? Even in the midst of all this terror. And so it's important. My wife tells me this sometimes as well, right? She's like, you're too serious. You gotta calm down, right? You can raise the blood pressure, right? Like, I get it, but that's what they understood as well, right? Like it was serious work, but they never lost sense of their humanity. And that has carried them forward to this day.
This is the last question.
Good morning, brother.
Good morning.
You mentioned the church. I'm an advisor of a minister on the campus. And what advice would you give a minister, in light of what you said earlier, to roll all these paper houses, big houses down and work this thing again?
Well, certainly we have great examples in the movement of Black clergy in general, Black clergy to be sure, playing a critical role in moving the movement forward. I think it's also important for us to acknowledge that there certainly were a lot of ministers on the front lines, but many more were not, right? And there were a lot of churches that refused to open their doors to the movement. They said it was too dangerous, not only for their clergy members and members, but even for the buildings. The first movement in Lowndes County opens up. They say, okay, we're gonna let the movement have its meetings here. And then that was decision 1. And decision 2 was, we need to increase our fire insurance because of the risks to the place. So these were real sacrifices, right? So I think 1, it's important to acknowledge that those ministers who are on the front line, like they and ministers and members of the church, like they're making real sacrifices. They should be held up. I think it's also important to thinking about sort of contemporary moment, Dr. King was a particular, using Dr. King for a second, or James Lawson, they were into that social gospel, the social justice ministry. We talk about social justice now, but they didn't see it as separate, right? They saw Jesus as a civil rights, human rights warrior, right? They were not interested in corporate Christianity, right? They weren't interested in mega churches, right? They were interested in justice. And I think, far too many, more than we need, have moved in a direction away from sort of social justice and that social gospel ministry. If we can tie back into that, I think the church would do better, but the church would also be a little bit more relevant to many young people today. But I do think it still has a major role in sort of moving the community forward. It will always, because the church as an institution, physically, but social networks, but then also that spirituality that can come out of the church. And talk about moving people and how do people survive, right? I mean, they're cracking jokes and singing, Sam Cooke songs, right? But they're also praying, right? I mean, they understand the risks and the stake. When they would say when they sang these freedom songs that were old Negro spirituals, right? They understood the roots. And they understood how having that connection to that spirituality was so important. It seems intangible because we want to look at, sort of the social analysis of who they're connecting with in the social networks. Yeah, but they were also praying, right? And they had people who were praying for them. And that made a big difference.